The Ottoman Empire had a system so brutally efficient that it turned human trafficking into official state policy. Every year, thousands of Christian children were forcibly taken from conquered territories across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. The boys became janissaries, elite soldiers who would fight for the empire that enslaved them. The girls disappeared into the imperial harem, a vast complex within Topkapi Palace, where they would compete for the attention of one man, the Sultan, knowing that only a handful would ever matter, and only one might become the mother of the next ruler of one of the most powerful empires on earth. This wasn't a romantic palace of luxury and leisure. This was an institution of systematic enslavement designed to serve one purpose: producing heirs to the Ottoman throne while ensuring that the Sultan's children had no powerful aristocratic families behind them who might challenge imperial authority. The logic was coldly practical. If the Sultan's mother had been a slave with no family connections, no noble bloodline, no external power base, then she posed no threat to the throne. Neither would her son. The hierarchy within the harem was rigid and merciless. At the bottom were the kariye, ordinary slaves who performed domestic work. Above them were the gozde, girls who had caught the Sultan's eye. Higher still were the iqbal, concubines who had shared the Sultan's bed. At the very top of this pyramid sat the Haseki Sultan, the chief consort. And above even her was the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan, the most powerful woman in the entire empire. Here's what textbooks don't tell you. Only one woman could become Valid Sultan. Only one son could inherit the throne. And since 1451, Ottoman law had made fratricide, the murder of brothers, not just legal but expected. When a new sultan took power, he was legally entitled, even encouraged, to execute all his brothers to prevent civil war. This meant that every mother of a prince in the imperial harem understood a simple mathematical reality. For her son to live, every other prince had to die. The system created a competition so vicious that mothers would spend decades plotting, scheming, and manipulating to ensure their sons' survival. They would form alliances, gather intelligence, cultivate relationships with powerful officials, and when necessary, eliminate threats. The Ottoman Empire had essentially industrialized the incentive for mothers to become political assassins. They didn't do this because they were evil. They did it because the system gave them no other choice. Maternal love in the imperial harem meant being willing to wade through rivers of blood to save your child. Contemporary records from the 16th century show that the harem housed hundreds of women at any given time, but only a fraction would ever become pregnant by the Sultan. Of those who did bear children, most would watch their sons and daughters die young from disease, accidents, or political necessity. The few whose sons survived childhood faced the ultimate test. When the Sultan died, would their son ascend to the throne, or would he be strangled with a silk cord in accordance with imperial law? Foreign ambassadors who visited the Ottoman court wrote extensively about this system. Venetian diplomats, who maintained detailed intelligence networks in Constantinople, sent regular reports back to Venice describing the intricate politics of the harem. They understood that the women behind the walls of Topkapi Palace often wielded more real power than the viziers and generals who appeared in public. But even these sophisticated observers couldn't have predicted what was about to happen when a particular enslaved girl arrived at the palace around 1520. But one enslaved girl would transform this already brutal system into something far more deadly. She would break precedents that had stood for 2 centuries. She would accumulate power that no concubine before her had ever dreamed of holding. And in doing so, she would trigger a cascade of violence that would echo through generations, ultimately contributing to tens of thousands of deaths. Her name was Alexandra Lisovska. History would remember her as Roxilana. The Ottomans called her Hurrem Sultan. And her rise from enslaved teenager to the most powerful woman in the Islamic world would redefine what was possible within the imperial harem, creating a template for female power that would destabilize the Ottoman succession for over a century. Sometime around 1502 to 1506, a girl was born in the town of Rohatin, in what is now Ukraine, but was then part of the Kingdom of Poland. Her name was probably Alexandra Lisovska, though historical records from her early life are virtually non-existent. She was most likely the daughter of a Ukrainian Orthodox priest, which meant she grew up in a relatively stable religious household, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be violently torn apart. Between 1517 and 1520, when Alexandra was approximately 15 to 18 years old, Crimean Tatar raiders attacked her region. These raids were a regular feature of life along the Ottoman frontier. Tatar horsemen would sweep into Christian villages, round up young people, and sell them into slavery. The Ottoman Empire maintained an entire economic infrastructure built on this human trafficking. Slave markets in Crimean ports like Kaffa did brisk business, and the most valuable commodities were young girls and boys who could be trained for service in Constantinople. Alexandra was captured, chained, and transported hundreds of miles to a slave market. We don't know the details of her journey, but we know what typically happened to girls in her situation. They were examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their bodies inspected, their value assessed based on youth, health, and appearance. The prettiest and youngest girls commanded the highest prices because they might end up in elite households or even the imperial harem itself. Someone, and records don't tell us who, purchased Alexandra and brought her to Constantinople. Eventually she entered the harem of Sultan Suleiman I, who had ascended to the throne in 1520 at age 26. When she arrived, she was given a new name. Europeans would call her Roxolana, meaning the Russian woman or the Ruthenian woman. The Ottomans called her Hürrem, meaning the cheerful one or the laughing one, supposedly because she had a pleasant disposition that caught the Sultan's attention.
Here's what you need to understand about Suleiman at this point in his reign. He was young, ambitious, and would become known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. He was also a man who already had a favored concubine, Mahidevran Sultan, who had given him a son named Mustafa around 1515. According to Ottoman custom, once a concubine bore a son, the Sultan typically stopped sleeping with her and moved on to other women. The goal was to have multiple sons by different mothers, creating several potential heirs.
But something unusual happened with Hürrem. Instead of having one son and being set aside, she kept the Sultan's attention. She bore him a son, Mehmed, in 1521, then a daughter, Mihrimah, in 1522, then another son, Abdullah, in 1523, though he died in infancy, then Selim in 1524, then Bayezid in 1525, then Cihangir in 1531. She gave Suleiman 6 children, 5 of whom survived childhood, an unprecedented situation that already violated the informal rules of harem politics. Contemporary sources, including the letters of European ambassadors stationed in Constantinople, noted this unusual arrangement. Normally, the Sultan would distribute his sexual attention among multiple concubines to create several competing maternal lines. Having so many children with one woman concentrated an enormous amount of potential power in Hürrem's hands. If any of her sons became Sultan, she would become Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. But Hürrem didn't stop at merely having multiple children with Suleiman. Sometime in the early 1530s, probably around 1534, she did something that hadn't been done in roughly 200 years. She convinced Suleiman to legally marry her. Ottoman sultans did not marry their concubines. They didn't need to. Concubinage was the standard arrangement, and it kept women in a state of legal dependence. But Suleiman broke this tradition and made Hürrem his legal wife, his Haseki Sultan. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. This was a political earthquake. A legal wife had rights and status that a concubine did not. She could own property in her own name. She could commission public works. She could send and receive official correspondence. Most importantly, she had legitimacy that could never be questioned. Then Hürrem broke another precedent. Ottoman tradition held that once a concubine bore a prince, she would be sent to govern a province alongside her son, preparing him for potential rule and keeping rival mothers physically separated from each other. This reduced the potential for violent conflict within the harem itself. But Hürrem refused to leave Constantinople. She remained in Topkapi Palace, close to Suleiman, close to the center of power. Surviving correspondence, now held in the Topkapi Palace archives, shows that Hürrem was extraordinarily literate and politically engaged. She wrote letters not just to Süleyman when he was away on military campaigns, but to governors, to foreign rulers, to religious leaders. She functioned as a political actor in her own right. She commissioned the construction of the Haseki Sultan Complex, a massive public works project including a mosque, schools, a hospital, and a soup kitchen for the poor. This wasn't just charity. This was a calculated move to build public legitimacy and present herself as a proper Muslim ruler, despite her Christian origins as a slave. By the mid-1530s, Hürrem had accomplished something no enslaved concubine had ever achieved. She had become the legal wife of the Sultan, the mother of multiple princes, a patron of architecture and public works, and a political correspondent who communicated directly with the powerful men of the empire. But there was one massive problem standing between her sons and the throne. Mustafa, the son of Mahidevran Sultan, was still alive. He was older than any of Hürrem's sons by nearly a decade. He was already governing a province and building a reputation as a competent, popular prince. He had the support of the Janissaries, the elite military corps who had significant influence over succession, and according to the logic of Ottoman succession, he was the most likely heir, which meant that if Mustafa became sultan, all of Hürrem's sons would be executed according to the law of fratricide. Every single one of them would be strangled to prevent future civil war. Hürrem had given birth to 5 princes, accumulated unprecedented power, and broken every rule in the book. But none of it would matter if Mustafa inherited the throne. The mathematics were brutally simple. For her children to live, Mustafa had to die. Mahidevran Sultan had every reason to believe her son would become the next ruler of the Ottoman Empire. She had entered Süleyman's harem before Hürrem arrived, and she had given him his first son, Mustafa, around 1515. In the traditional logic of the Ottoman system, first son of the Sultan meant first in line for the throne. Mustafa had been raised from birth with the understanding that he would one day rule one of the most powerful empires on earth. By the 1530s and 1540s, Mustafa was proving himself to be everything an Ottoman prince should be. He was militarily competent, personally courageous, and genuinely popular among both the common people and the Janissary corps. When he governed the province of Manisa, he earned a reputation as a just and effective administrator. Foreign ambassadors who met him reported that he was intelligent, charismatic, and seemed destined for greatness. Even his father, Süleyman, reportedly admired his capabilities. But here's where the mathematics of the Ottoman succession system became absolutely lethal. Süleyman had multiple sons. Mustafa was the oldest and most capable. But Hürrem had given Süleyman 5 sons who survived infancy: Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, plus her oldest son, who had died. If Mustafa became sultan, Ottoman law was crystal clear about what would happen next. The law of fratricide, formally established by Sultan Mehmed II in 1451, stated that whichever prince ascended to the throne had the legal right and obligation to execute all his brothers. The law wasn't created out of cruelty, it was created out of bitter historical experience. The Ottoman Empire had nearly been destroyed in the early 15th century by civil wars between rival princes. Brothers had raised armies against each other, torn the empire apart, and caused thousands of deaths in succession conflicts. Mehmed II decided that legal fratricide was better than civil war. Better to execute your brothers immediately upon taking power than to risk them raising rebellions that could kill tens of thousands. This meant that Mahidevran and Hürrem weren't just rival mothers competing for status or influence. They were fighting a zero-sum game where only one set of children could survive. If Mustafa became sultan, Hürrem's sons would be killed. If one of Hürrem's sons became sultan, Mustafa would be killed. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no possibility of sharing power. The system had been designed to ensure that only one line survived. Contemporary records show that Hürrem understood this reality with perfect clarity. Surviving letters from her to Süleyman, written when he was away on military campaigns, show a woman who was acutely aware of political dynamics and potential threats. She wrote about matters of state, about governors and their loyalties, about potential dangers to the Sultan and his sons. She functioned not just as a wife, but as a political intelligence officer. Here's where the historical record becomes complicated and debated among scholars. Starting in the 1540s, reports began reaching Suleiman that Mustafa might be plotting against him. Letters suggested that Mustafa was building a power base that could threaten the Sultan's authority. Some sources claimed that Mustafa was in contact with Safavid Persia, the Ottoman Empire's greatest rival, and might be planning rebellion. The question that historians have debated for centuries is this: were these reports real evidence of conspiracy, or were they manufactured by Hurrem and her allies to eliminate a threat to her sons? We know from surviving correspondence that Hurrem wrote to Suleiman about concerns regarding Mustafa's loyalty. We know that she had relationships with powerful officials at court who would have had reason to support her sons over Mustafa. We know that the accusations against Mustafa intensified over time, but we don't have definitive proof that Hurrem orchestrated a false conspiracy. What we do have is a clear pattern. As Mustafa's popularity grew, so did the whispers about his disloyalty. Venetian ambassadors, who maintained the best intelligence network in Constantinople, sent detailed reports back to Venice about the growing tension. They noted that Mustafa was so popular with the Janissaries that he could potentially rally them to his side if he chose to rebel. They also noted that Hurrem had unprecedented influence over Suleiman and that she was clearly working to advance her own son's positions. These diplomatic observers understood that they were watching a power struggle that would determine the future of the empire. The law of fratricide had created a perverse incentive structure. It wasn't enough for a prince to be loyal, competent, and popular. In fact, being too popular, too competent, too successful could be the very thing that got you killed. If your father, the Sultan, began to see you as a threat, if your success made him worry that you might not wait for him to die naturally, then you became a target. And if you had ambitious rivals whose own son's survival depended on your death, then you were in even greater danger. By 1553, the situation had reached a critical point. Mustafa was in his late 30s, at the height of his abilities, governing his province effectively and maintaining the loyalty of the Janissary corps. Hurrem's oldest surviving son, Mehmed, had died of smallpox in 1543, which meant Selim was now her eldest. But Selim was known to be less capable than Mustafa, possibly an alcoholic, definitely less martially competent. If succession were based purely on merit, Mustafa would win easily. That's when Sultan Suleiman made his decision. In October 1553, while on a military campaign in Anatolia preparing for war with Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his camp at Ereğli. Protocol demanded that a prince come when his father the Sultan called. Mustafa knew the summons was dangerous. His supporters warned him not to go, but refusing a direct imperial command would be proof of disloyalty, and that would give Suleiman legal justification to move against him anyway. Mustafa was trapped. If he went, he might be killed. If he refused to go, he definitely would be killed, and his refusal would be used as evidence that he had been plotting rebellion all along. Mustafa chose to go. He entered his father's tent to pay his respects, and waiting inside were deaf-mute executioners, men specifically employed by Ottoman sultans because they could commit royal murders without ever being able to testify about what they'd witnessed. They fell upon Mustafa and strangled him with a bowstring. He was approximately 38 years old. The most popular, most capable prince of his generation was dead, and every single one of Hurrem Sultan's sons had just become infinitely more likely to inherit the throne. The first death in what would become a cascade of violence had just occurred, and the Ottoman Empire would spend the next century paying the price for what happened in that tent. The execution of Mustafa on October 6, 1553, sent immediate shockwaves through the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't a quiet assassination that could be covered up. This happened at a military camp filled with soldiers, many of whom were Janissaries who had personal loyalty to Mustafa. When word spread that the prince was dead, strangled on his father's orders, the camp erupted. Janissaries rioted. These were elite troops, the core of the Ottoman military, and they had expected Mustafa to be their next sultan. His death meant that a less capable prince would inherit the throne, and it meant that their own political future was suddenly uncertain. Historical accounts from the period describe chaos in the camp. Some janissaries openly wept. Others called for rebellion. The situation was so volatile that Suleiman's viziers feared the entire army might mutiny. Suleiman moved quickly to suppress the unrest. He executed the ringleaders of the protests. He redistributed bonuses and promotions to buy loyalty. He gave speeches about how Mustafa had been plotting treason and how the execution had been necessary to preserve the empire. Whether the soldiers believed him or simply calculated that rebellion would be suicide, the immediate crisis was contained. But the damage was done. Hundreds of men died in the suppression of the Janissary unrest, either executed for insubordination or killed in scattered fighting, as loyalists put down protests. Contemporary sources, particularly the detailed reports from Venetian ambassadors who had intelligence networks throughout the Ottoman court, documented the aftermath. They noted that Mahidevran Sultan, Mustafa's mother, was devastated. She had lost her only son, and with him, any hope of power or security. She would live another 28 years until 1581, but she lived them in obscurity, a reminder of what happened to mothers whose sons lost the succession struggle. The historical debate about Hurrem's role in Mustafa's death has raged for nearly 500 years. Some historians argue that there's no direct evidence that she manufactured the conspiracy accusations, that perhaps Mustafa really was planning rebellion, or that Suleiman made the decision independently based on genuine concerns about succession stability. Other historians, particularly Leslie Pierce in her extensively researched biographies, argue that the pattern of accusations, the timing, and Hurrem's clear political acumen all suggest she played a significant role in orchestrating Mustafa's downfall. What we know for certain is this: Hurrem had the motive. Her sons' lives depended on Mustafa's death. She had the means. Her letters show she had political influence and relationships with powerful officials. She had the opportunity. She was married to Suleiman and had his ear in a way no concubine before her ever had. And she had the result. With Mustafa dead, her sons were the only viable heirs to the throne. Hurrem herself didn't live to see her ultimate victory. She died on April 15, 1558, probably from illness related to age. She was approximately 52 to 56 years old. She was buried with full honors in a magnificent tomb adjacent to the Suleymaniye Mosque, the grand mosque complex that Suleiman had commissioned. Her funeral was attended by the highest officials of the empire. The enslaved girl from Ukraine had died as the legal wife of the Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Islamic history. But her death didn't end the story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning of the consequences. When Suleiman died in 1566, Hurrem's son Selim II inherited the throne. And this is where the systemic damage that Hurrem's precedent-breaking really began to show. Selim was not a strong sultan. Historical accounts describe him as more interested in wine than warfare, more focused on harem pleasures than governance. He earned the nickname Selim the Sot, or Selim the Drunkard. Under normal circumstances, a weak prince wouldn't have inherited the throne. The Ottoman system was supposed to produce the strongest possible sultan through competition among princes. But Hurrem had changed the rules. She had concentrated all of Suleiman's heirs in her own lineage by giving him multiple sons and by eliminating the competition. Selim became sultan not because he was the best candidate, but because he was the only option left after Mustafa was dead, and after Selim's more capable brother Bayezid had been executed in 1562 following a failed rebellion. This established a pattern that would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations. The period from roughly 1570 to 1680 is known to historians as the Sultanate of Women, and it began with the precedents that Hurrem had set. Strong, politically active mothers controlling weak sons who occupied the throne. Valid sultans accumulating power while their sons proved incapable of effective rule. Selim's mother was dead, but his wife, Nurbanu Sultan, followed Hurrem's template. She was a former slave who had been captured from Venetian territory. She accumulated enormous political power as Valide Sultan, when her son Murad III took the throne in 1574, and she, in turn, was succeeded by her daughter-in-law Safiye Sultan, another former slave who wielded even more dramatic power over her son Mehmed III. And this is where we begin to count the true cost of the system that Hürrem had helped consolidate. Because when Mehmed III became Sultan in January 1595, he followed the law of fratricide to its logical extreme. He ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers. 19 princes were strangled in a single day. Some were adults, some were teenagers. The youngest was 11 months old, a baby who posed no conceivable threat to anyone, but was killed anyway because Ottoman law required it. The executions didn't stop with the princes. Mehmed also ordered the drowning of approximately 20 pregnant concubines of his deceased father. These were women who might give birth to male children who could potentially be future rivals. So they were sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. Historical sources from the period describe this mass execution as one of the most shocking events in Ottoman history, so disturbing that even court chroniclers, who were accustomed to political violence, seemed troubled by the scale. But the violence wasn't finished. The system of fratricide, combined with the precedent of powerful mothers controlling weak sultans, created chronic instability. When sultans were incompetent, provinces rebelled. When rebellions happened, the central government responded with mass executions. Janissaries who had grown accustomed to power during periods of weak rule would revolt when stronger sultans tried to reassert control, leading to more purges and more deaths. The Ottoman succession system, which had been brutal but functional for most of the 15th and early 16th centuries, had become a machine for producing instability and violence. And while Hürrem herself hadn't created this system, she had broken the traditional safeguards that had kept it somewhat contained. She had shown that a mother could accumulate unprecedented power, that she could successfully eliminate rival princes, and that she could ensure her own sons inherited the throne regardless of their capability. Every ambitious mother who came after her learned the same lesson. In the Ottoman system, maternal love meant being willing to kill anyone who threatened your child's path to power. And with Hürrem's precedents established, the scale of that killing had escalated dramatically. The cascade of violence that began with Mustafa's execution in 1553 would echo through Ottoman history for over a century, contributing to tens of thousands of deaths in executions, rebellions, and succession wars that might have been avoided if the empire had maintained its earlier, slightly less personalized approach to royal succession. The death of Hürrem Sultan in 1558 should have ended her story. She was buried in splendor, mourned by the empire, and remembered as one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. But the system she had helped to create was just beginning to reveal its true cost. The precedents she had broken, the concentration of power she had achieved, the template she had established for future mothers of princes, all of this would metastasize into something far more destructive than anyone could have anticipated. When Selim II died in 1574, his son Murad III inherited the throne. Murad had 19 brothers, and according to the law of fratricide, he had every legal right to execute all of them immediately upon taking power. But Murad, perhaps troubled by the scale of what this would mean, hesitated. He allowed several of his brothers to live, keeping them confined in a section of the palace that became known as the cafes, or the cage. This was a new innovation in Ottoman succession management. Instead of killing potential rivals, lock them away in luxurious imprisonment, where they couldn't threaten the throne, but also couldn't be accused of plotting rebellion. The cafes system sounds more humane than mass execution, and in some ways it was. Princes lived in comfortable apartments with servants, concubines, and entertainment. But they were prisoners. They couldn't leave. They couldn't govern provinces. They couldn't develop military or administrative skills. They grew up in a golden cage, cut off from the real world, often developing psychological problems from the isolation and from the knowledge that at any moment, a change in political winds could mean their execution. Murad III's reign showed another consequence of the Sultanate of Women. His mother, Nurbanu Sultan, wielded enormous power as Valid Sultan, following the exact playbook that Hürrem had created. She interfered in government appointments, she influenced policy decisions, she accumulated wealth, and she protected her son's position, even as it became clear that Murad was more interested in his harem than in governance. Historical records indicate that Murad fathered over 100 children with his concubines, an almost incomprehensible number that suggests he spent more time in the harem than in the council chambers. When Murad died in 1595, the succession passed to his son Mehmed III, and this is where the mathematical horror of the Ottoman system reached its peak. Mehmed had 19 brothers. Under the law of fratricide, they all had to die. On January 27, 1595, in what became known as one of the darkest days in Ottoman history, Mehmed ordered the execution of all 19 of his brothers in a single coordinated massacre. The executions were carried out by deaf-mute executioners using the traditional method, strangulation with a bowstring. The princes ranged in age from young men in their 20s down to infants. The youngest was only 11 months old. Contemporary chronicles describe the scene in horrifying detail. 19 bodies laid out in the palace, 19 silk shrouds, 19 princes who died not because they had committed any crime, not because they had plotted any rebellion, but simply because they had the misfortune of being brothers to the new sultan. But Mehmed wasn't finished. Ottoman law and custom had another brutal provision. If a deceased sultan had left pregnant concubines, and if those women gave birth to sons, those sons would be potential future claimants to the throne. So Mehmed ordered the execution of approximately 20 pregnant concubines who had been in his father's harem. These women were sewn into weighted sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus. They died not for anything they had done, but for the possibility of what they might give birth to. Foreign observers were shocked. Even by the standards of 16th century political violence, this was extreme. European ambassadors sent reports describing the mass executions, and these reports contributed to the European image of the Ottomans as barbaric and cruel. But what these observers didn't fully understand was that this wasn't deviation from Ottoman law. This was Ottoman law functioning exactly as designed. The law of fratricide, the concentration of power in single lineages, the incentives for mothers to eliminate all potential rivals to their sons, all of this was working as intended. The problem was that what was intended had become monstrous. Mehmed III's mother, Safiye Sultan, was another former Christian slave who had risen to become Valide Sultan, and she followed the same pattern as Hürrem and Nurbanu before her. She accumulated political power, influenced state decisions, and protected her son's position. But Mehmed was weak, possibly mentally unstable, and his reign was marked by military defeats, internal rebellions, and administrative chaos. The Ottoman Empire, which had reached its territorial peak under Suleiman the Magnificent, was beginning its long decline, and the succession system was a significant factor in that decline. The violence didn't end with Mehmed's accession. His reign saw multiple rebellions in the provinces. When provincial governors or military commanders revolted against the weak central authority, the empire responded with mass executions. When janissaries, who had grown accustomed to wielding political power during periods of weak sultans, tried to assert their influence too aggressively, they were purged in bloody crackdowns. The pattern repeated over and over. Weak sultan leads to provincial unrest. Unrest leads to rebellion. Rebellion leads to violent suppression. Suppression creates resentment. Resentment leads to more unrest. Historical records and chronicles from this period document thousands of deaths in these cycles of rebellion and repression. The Jalali revolts, which lasted from 1595 to 1610, were a series of uprisings primarily in Anatolia, driven by a combination of economic distress, military dissatisfaction, and weak central authority. The Ottoman response was brutal. Villages were burned, suspected rebels were executed en masse, and entire regions were depopulated. Estimates of casualties from the Jalali revolts alone range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 deaths. This is where the connection to Hürrem Sultan becomes more indirect but still causally relevant. The system of weak sultans controlled by powerful mothers, the system that allowed succession based on maternal manipulation rather than princely capability, the system that concentrated all heirs in single lineages through the elimination of rivals. This system produced rulers who were unprepared for the demands of governing a vast empire. And when those rulers failed, the empire bled. Consider the chain of causation. Hurrem consolidated power in a way no concubine before her had managed. She ensured that only her sons could inherit. Her son Selim II was weak, establishing a pattern. Selim's son Murad III was even weaker, more focused on harem pleasures than governance. Murad's son Mehmed III was perhaps the weakest of all, and his accession required the mass execution of 19 brothers. Mehmed's weakness contributed to the Jalali revolts and the instability of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Each generation, the sultans got weaker. Each generation, the Valide sultans got more powerful. Each generation, the gap between the demands of ruling an empire and the capabilities of the rulers grew wider, and each generation, the violence required to maintain the system escalated. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse immediately. It would survive in various forms until 1922. But the seeds of its long decline were planted in this period. The Sultanate of Women, which began with Hurrem's unprecedented accumulation of power, created a century of instability that the empire never fully recovered from. Historians debate the exact numbers, and we need to be honest about the limitations of historical records. We don't have precise casualty figures for every rebellion, every purge, every cycle of violence during this period. But what we do have are chronicles, diplomatic reports, administrative records, and demographic studies that all point to the same conclusion. The late 16th and early 17th centuries were extraordinarily violent periods in Ottoman history, and the succession system was a major contributing factor to that violence. Now we need to address the number directly: 30,000 deaths. This isn't a figure you'll find in any single historical document. There's no Ottoman record that says Hurrem Sultan caused 30,000 deaths. What we're dealing with is an aggregate estimate based on the cumulative consequences of the system that she helped to consolidate and the cascade of violence that followed from the precedents she established. This requires us to be methodologically honest about how we arrive at such numbers and what they actually represent. Let's break down the components. First, the direct executions. Mustafa's death in 1553 wasn't just one prince. When he was killed, his supporters in the Janissary Corps rebelled. Contemporary sources mention hundreds executed in the immediate suppression of that rebellion. Taking a conservative estimate, that's at least 200 to 500 deaths directly traceable to the elimination of Mustafa as a rival to Hurrem's sons. Second, the succession executions in subsequent generations. When Mehmed III took power in 1595, he executed 19 brothers and approximately 20 pregnant concubines. But those weren't isolated murders. Each prince had attendants, supporters, and associates. Some of these people were executed alongside the princes they served. Some fled and were hunted down. Some joined rebellions that were later crushed. A reasonable estimate of deaths directly connected to Mehmed III's accession purges, including the princes themselves, their households, and the ripple effects, is several hundred to over 1,000. Third, the rebellions caused by succession instability. The Jalali revolts, which erupted partly due to the weakness of central authority during the reigns of Selim II, Murad III, and Mehmed III, resulted in massive casualties. Historical estimates for deaths during the Jalali revolts range from 40,000 to 100,000 or more, though these numbers are debated and difficult to verify with precision. Not all of these deaths can be attributed to the succession system alone. Economic factors, military dissatisfaction, and regional issues all played roles. But the weakness of the sultans during this period, a weakness directly connected to the system that allowed maternal manipulation rather than merit to determine succession, was a significant contributing factor. Fourth, the broader pattern of instability from 1550 to 1650. This century saw numerous provincial rebellions, military mutinies, and succession crises. Each of these events resulted in casualties. Governors who rebelled were executed along with their supporters. Janissaries who mutinied were purged. Pretenders to the throne were hunted down and killed along with anyone who had supported them. Adding up the documented rebellions, purges, and succession conflicts during this period gives us thousands more deaths. Fifth, the long-term systemic effects. The Café system, which developed partly in response to the horror of mass fratricide, produced sultans who were psychologically damaged and administratively incompetent because they had been imprisoned in luxury their entire lives. These sultans made poor decisions that led to military defeats, which led to more instability, which led to more internal conflicts and purges. The causal chains get more attenuated the further out we go, but the connection remains. So how do we get to 30,000? We aggregate. Direct executions of princes and their households, roughly 1 to 2,000. Rebellion suppressions directly tied to succession crises, several thousand. Jalali revolts and similar uprisings during the period of weak sultans, tens of thousands. Other provincial conflicts, military purges, and succession-related violence, several thousand more. The total, using conservative estimates from multiple sources, reaches into the tens of thousands. 30,000 is within the plausible range, though historians might reasonably argue for numbers somewhat higher or lower, depending on how they attribute causation. But here's the critical point. We're not saying that Hurrem Sultan personally killed 30,000 people. We're saying that the system she helped to create, the precedents she established, the concentration of power she achieved, and the template she provided for future mothers of princes contributed to a cascade of violence over multiple generations that resulted in approximately 30,000 deaths. This is a different kind of historical responsibility than direct culpability for murder. Leslie Pierce, one of the foremost historians of the Ottoman imperial harem, argues in her work that the Sultanate of Women period was characterized by chronic instability precisely because the system had shifted from a model where multiple capable princes competed for the throne to a model where single lineages monopolized succession and where maternal influence replaced military and administrative merit. This shift began with Hurrem. It intensified with Nurbanu. It reached its peak with Safiye, and the consequences were devastating. The Ottoman Empire had created a succession system based on fratricide to prevent civil wars. The logic was brutal, but clear. Better to execute brothers immediately than to fight costly wars of succession. But when that system was combined with the concentration of power that Hurrem achieved, it created a new problem. Weak sultans produced by powerful mothers who manipulated succession led to instability that caused the very violence the system was designed to prevent. The law of fratricide hadn't eliminated civil war, it had just changed the form that civil war took. Instead of princes fighting each other with armies, the empire was plagued by provincial rebellions against weak central authority and by savage purges to maintain control. The deepest irony is that Hurrem herself probably believed she was protecting her children. She was a mother operating within an impossible system. She had been enslaved as a teenager, brought to a foreign palace, and placed in a competition where only one woman's children could survive. She did what she had to do to save her sons. She broke precedents, accumulated power, and eliminated threats. And it worked. Her son Selim became Sultan. Her grandson Murad became Sultan. Her great-grandson Mehmed became Sultan. Her lineage continued, but the price of that success was paid by thousands of people over multiple generations who died in the violence that her precedents had helped to unleash. The Ottoman succession system was already brutal before Hurrem arrived. The law of fratricide had been established more than 70 years before she was born. Maternal competition was built into the structure of the imperial harem. But Hurrem changed the scale. She showed that a mother could not just survive the system, but master it. And every mother who came after her learned the same lesson. In a system where only one set of children could survive, there was no limit to the violence that could be justified in the name of maternal protection. History textbooks often present Hurrem Sultan as a romantic figure, The slave who became an empress. The concubine who captured the heart of the most powerful man in the world. The woman who broke barriers and wielded power in a male-dominated society. All of that is true. But it's also true that her success came at an extraordinary cost. The system she navigated was designed to produce violence, and by succeeding within that system so spectacularly, she ensured that the violence would escalate. 30,000 is a number, but behind that number are names we'll never know. Princes strangled in palace rooms. Janissaries executed for backing the wrong candidate. Villagers killed in rebellions suppressed by weak sultans. Pregnant women drowned in the Bosphorus because they might give birth to boys who could someday threaten the throne. Each of those deaths was a person. Each was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. And each death was, in some way, a consequence of a system that turned maternal love into a motive for mass murder. Hürrem Sultan died in 1558, probably believing she had secured her children's future. And she had. Her descendants ruled the Ottoman Empire for generations. But she had also secured something else. A legacy of violence that would echo through Ottoman history for over a century. A template for power that turned the imperial harem from a brutal institution into something even more deadly. And a body count that, while we can never know the exact number, certainly reached into the tens of thousands. The enslaved girl from Ukraine who became the most powerful woman in the Islamic world had helped to create a machine for producing orphans, widows, and corpses. That's the part of her story that doesn't make it into the romantic retellings. But it's the part that matters most when we're trying to understand the true human cost of power, ambition, and survival in one of history's most brutal political systems.